suck.
Oh no.
I'm not supposed to say the Beamer, but they're awful. They're awful. Don't even ask. Oh, it's the worst. It's the worst, yeah. It's awful.
Because the Mets and the Yankees were sort of.
Yeah, no, they're fine. My Red Sox.
We are basically.
Yeah.
It's early here
Whoever did that. Okay, so sit over here.
Okay.
And then we're good.
And how long are we going for again?
So we'll keep it for a half an hour, 20 minutes. Yeah, we have a mic. She's going to be the, we call it the Phil Donager. So let's start. Wow, that is really big. We're going to start only because I want you to be able to hear from Rabbi Burger and be able to eventually ask questions. And we know that there are folks tuning in from home. A number of folks said they couldn't come or somebody's a little under the weather, and that's great. Torah always leads the way. There's a rabbinic portion, Torah portion acronym that has to do with the last 2 weeks' portions and this week's Shabbat's portion. So it starts with a couple of weeks ago, we read Acharei Mot, which is all about the death of Aaron's 2 sons and how careful we have to be approaching the Holy One. Then the next portion of the Torah is Kedoshim, which is really the holy code for how to be a humane, menschy human being. And then this week we read Emor, which is really all about speaking the guidelines to create sacred community. But the rabbis of old put all three together. Acharei Mot, Kedoshim, Emor. After the death of the holy, speak. That is what Rabbi Ariel Burger has been doing, transforming the lessons for living of Professor Elie Wiesel's classroom into the covenant code for inspiring a new generation of moral leaders. He was our Larchmont Temple Scholar in Residence pre-COVID in January of 2020. And when he got here and when he taught us 2.5 years ago, it was as if he was coming back home, sort of meant to be here. And now that he's back, it's like, pardon the expression, it's the prodigal son. I mean, come on. It is really the gift tonight for him to come back, to give us a taste of his life work, the generation of dynamic thinkers and open-hearted doers that he is nourishing through the Witness Institute, and by being here, really making us all witnesses, summoned to the work of responding to a fractured world by realizing the holiness that we carry in our hearts and through our hands. I could not feel more privileged to welcome back our righteous, gracious, humble-hearted, brilliant, inspiring teacher, Rabbi Ariel Burger.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Rabbi Sorkman. Hi, everyone on the live stream, especially Amy and Howard. It's great to be back with all of you. And I want to begin with a story. It's a story that Professor Wiesel liked to tell that captures the heart of what I want to share with you tonight. The story is there was a man who was so incredibly forgetful that every morning when he woke up, he couldn't identify any of the objects in his home. So he didn't know what his jacket was, his shirt, his pants, his shoes, his toothbrush, and he couldn't function. And it would take him hours and hours to figure out how to get up and how to get dressed and how to get out of the house. And he went to his Rebbe, he went to his master, and he asked for advice. And the master said, this is a story about a mediocre master, which is rare. The master said, it's very easy. Go home and label all your stuff. Put Post-it notes on everything. So you have a Post-it note on your jacket that says, this is a jacket, you wear it on top of your shirt. Put a Post-it note on your toothbrush that says you put toothpaste on this and you rub it against your teeth for about 3 minutes or 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes. And then they got off into a whole Talmudic conversation about how long you brush your teeth for. and so on. Keep labeling everything and you'll figure it out. So the man went home and he followed his rabbi's advice. He labeled everything in his home. And the next morning he got up. And lo and behold, for the first time in years, he was able to get dressed and brush his teeth and make a coffee. And he was dressed, he was fully dressed and ready to leave the house. And as he's about to exit his door, there's a mirror by the door. And he sees his own reflection in the mirror and he says, "But who am I?" We are living in a world on fire. We are living in a world that's hurting. The world, I often think, is like a baby in our arms and the baby has a fever. So imagine for a moment that you're holding a little baby, your baby or a beloved's baby, and the baby has a fever. What do you feel? You feel a fierce tenderness, a fierce caring. You want to do whatever you can do to help the baby get well. You feel protective. You'll fight off anyone who comes to threaten the baby, whether it's a fever or another person or anything. And that combination of ferocity and tenderness, an open heart, and the willingness to fight for what you believe in is really the definitive characteristic of what it means to be a moral person in the world today. And in a world that's on fire, and when the baby has a fever, we're living in a society and a culture, not just in this country, but globally, in modern life, where we are offered technical solutions to things. We are offered a lot of labels to things. So label your clothing and label your toothbrush and everything will be all right. Well, it's true that we need those labels. It's true that we need technical solutions and tools. But if we forget about the fundamental question of who am I, we are all in trouble. And so I'm here tonight to speak with you about moral transformation. The teachings of Professor Elie Wiesel. I'm extremely pleased and honored to be with all of you, and especially pleased that my dear friend Alicia Wiesel is here with us, my partner in all of this experimentation and our efforts to make the world better by investing in moral leadership. But what is moral leadership, and what is moral transformation? Well, the way we talk about moral leadership and moral transformation is inspired by the way Professor Elie Wiesel spoke about moral leadership and moral transformation. And the way he spoke about the word morality was the process of learning and inquiring, deepening your thinking, wrestling with issues, challenging yourself, challenging your assumptions, and finding ways to be more compassionate and more courageous. Morality is not, in his words, the process of staking out a position and then arguing with people who disagree with you and trying to persuade them that they are living wrong. Morality is not about finger wagging. It's not moralizing. It's a process of learning. And in this world today, we desperately need that process of learning. We created something called the Witness Institute, which is an organization dedicated to advancing moral leadership and moral education through the teachings of Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory. And at the center of our work in the Witness Institute is a question. And it's a question that I think is on many of our minds today. How does a person become more compassionate? How does a person become more courageous? How does the world actually change? How do we spark people to be agents of goodness, of connection, of humility, of justice, of peace in the world? How does it actually happen? We all know that it's easy to talk about. How does it actually work? And what I want to share with you is our tentative response to that question. And it's tentative. We are a laboratory. We are experimenting a lot. We're testing things out. Professor Wiesel used to say often, I don't have answers, I have questions. I have good questions. Fanatics have answers. They don't have any questions. And so that's why fanatics and I don't get along. Many of us have questions, and if we learn to celebrate those questions and share them with one another, they can lead to more questions. Professor Wiesel used to quote another great Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said, someone can ask a question at a certain time in a certain place, and many years later, someone else in a different place and a different time can ask a different question, not realizing, neither of them realizing, that the second question is a response to the first question. There are conversations that continue over many generations. They're not resolved. There are certain questions we live with as human beings that are so large and enduring that they cannot be answered in a single lifetime. And this is why I think we need to turn to the wisdom of the past. This is why Professor Wiesel taught literature. This is why ancient philosophers and poets matter today. That's why reading matters today. And when we turn to that great wisdom and create a dialogue between our own thinking and our own questioning and those great questions of the past, we have a chance of going deeper into the fundamental questions facing us today. How do we balance our quest for justice with a commitment to peace? How do we work towards a better world without burning out? How do we make sure that as we work with great passion for the causes we care about, that we don't forget the humanity of our opponents? How do we learn to disagree well in a world that seems to have forgotten how to disagree well? And these questions are very, very enduring and large questions. And they're the kinds of questions that we explore in the context of the Witness Institute. I'll share very, very briefly, and I want to ask you, before I go any further, I should have said this at the beginning, as I share what I share with you, if a question pops into your mind and you have something to write with, would you write it down? We'll have a chance to share questions a little bit later, and questions are important. The most important part of this evening is the questions, and Alicia has a question.
Just a technical question. For those of us who don't have pen and paper, is it considered rude if we use our iPhones to write down?
I was going to say absolutely fine to do that. And for those of you whose children are in the last innings of a Little League game, it's also acceptable to... They lost? Oh, okay. Next time we'll come back and we'll do the learning earlier so it'll infuse the game with more positive energy. Yeah, it's fine to write the questions down on your phones, but really capture the questions because I don't want to lose those. They're very precious in this kind of work. And so what I want to share with you is thoughts about the mechanics of moral transformation. How does the work of growing as a moral person, as an agent, as a citizen of the world who's bringing goodness to the world actually happen? And before I do that, I want to share very briefly the structure and the context in which these conversations are taking place, which is the Witness Institute. The Witness Institute is an idea that began in conversation with Professor Wiesel in 2008. And for many reasons, it was on the back burner for a long time, but always in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of his mind, was the idea that as a Nobel Peace Prize winning educator and author and activist and peacemaker, there were teachings from this great man that could be distilled and then shared with new generations. How might we do that? So when I would visit him in the last 8 or so years of his life, every once in a while he would ask me, what are your thoughts about the Institute? And I was working a full-time job. It wasn't a practical question, but he was thinking about it because the world needs those kinds of lessons, and the world needs the kind of opportunity to study the lessons and teachings of a great exemplar of moral leadership. And then Alicia and I started talking about what would it look like to actually create this model of an institute to train leaders, new generations of leaders, in Elie Wiesel's approach to moral education. What would that look like? What would be the core principles? What's the right structure? And so we met and we spent a lot of time with large Post-it notes, scribbling and mapping things out and brainstorming and dreaming. And what we arrived at was an idea to create cohorts of fellows who are young leaders in different fields, working on different projects in different areas of the world, different geographies, different ideologies, to bring them together in small groups and to create a very carefully designed environment in which people can ask very, very difficult questions about their own beliefs and assumptions, in which they could encounter people who believe very different things and hold very different positions than their own without freaking out, running away, or without becoming combative, and in which they could also cultivate their own capacities as leaders, their own strengths, but also looking at their weaknesses, their own beliefs, their own unchallenged or unexamined assumptions. And in this way, we believed that we could borrow from the model of Professor Wiesel's classroom, which was itself an incredible laboratory for moral change and moral education, and bring it out of the academy, out of the university, and into the field and into the streets where people are doing very difficult work. And so fast forward, we now have 2 cohorts of the Witness Fellowship. One just completed their 15-month process of being together and studying together, and one just launched about 3 months ago. And we're planning our first ever in-person retreat this summer with both cohorts together, where they're going to meet for the first time. After, it must be said, we've been through some stuff these last 2 years, haven't we? They have never met in person, but they talk about how they feel like they're family. They support one another in very profound ways. The fellows have laughed a lot together, they've cried together. I shared with some of you earlier that one of our fellows was diagnosed with COVID, and the doctor said, "We don't think you're ever going to walk again." This happened during the fellowship. She talks about it publicly, so I feel comfortable sharing it with you here. And she's recovered miraculously. I'll tell you that already, so you don't worry too much. But as she was going through all of this, the fellows reached out to her. One of our other fellows sent her a song, a video of a song that he was playing every day for 90 days, the first 90 days of her hospital stay and her beginning of her rehab. Another fellow knitted a quilt for her and asked for feedback and input from the group about color choices and the meaning of different colors. One of our fellows, in a completely different context, created a signature cocktail for the cohort called a Witness Teeny. I don't remember the recipe by heart, or I would tell you. But they've done a lot of work together to really build a very special space. It's all been online. And so one of the things that we've discovered is that you can do this work of moral reflection even when you're not in person. There are limits, of course, but look how far you can go even when you're not in the same space. Our fellows come from around the country, and they come from many different ideological stances and positions. We've got conservative and progressive fellows and everything in between. They're from many different religious backgrounds. This is not a Jewish project per se, it's a universal project with a Jewish inflection. We talk about universal questions in a Jewish key. We are drawing on the example of a great Jewish leader and thinker, but he was a universalist as well, and he saw the particular identity, his own particular identity as a Jew, as not only not a contradiction to universal human commitments, but as absolutely reinforcing universal commitments. And so a lot of the work of this fellowship involves arguing, encountering, discovering the flaws in my own beliefs, the unexamined assumptions that I bring to the work. Given that background, and the fellowship itself is a 15-month experience where the fellows, at the end of the experience, create a project to bring back out to their communities, because we believe a lot in the multiplier effect and the importance of application. So I want to share with you some of the principles of the mechanics of moral transformation tonight. I'm not going to share all of them. We've developed 7 principles that have emerged as really, really key and really important in the work that we do. I just want to share a little bit of these, a little sense of these, and then we'll open to your questions and continue the conversation together. How does moral transformation happen? That's the headline question. So one of the things that we've discovered in the writings and the teachings of Professor Wiesel is that one of the most powerful and consistent ways that moral transformation happens is through a story. It's through the power of a story. And it's not just any story, it's the kind of story that when you hear it, you get goosebumps, or you have chills running up and down your spine, or your eyes well up with tears. It's a story that hits you very profoundly. And it's a story that you carry with you ever after. So I want to briefly share a story with you. It's an example for me of the power of a story, and it's a story that has shaped me over the last several years, and that I carry with me, and it has changed my behavior in noticeable ways. So here's the story. My son, Yovel, was studying in Israel for a semester 3 years ago now. And as part of the program, they traveled to Poland to visit the centers of Jewish life before the war, and also to visit the sites of several of the concentration and death camps. And they were there in Poland for about 10 days, about 100 teenagers together on this program. And my son had a best friend on the program whose name is Mason. And on one of the days of the program, in the middle of this 10-day period in Poland, Mason disappeared with one of the counselors for a day. He just took off and didn't tell anyone where he was going. And he came back late that night and wouldn't tell anyone where he had been. He was very, very mysterious about it. But he told my son Yovel, because they were good friends, and I think really because my son Yovel nudged him a lot. That's my guess. And he told him the following. He said, my great-grandparents were married 3 weeks before the deportation to Auschwitz. They were deported, and for the first weeks in the camp, somehow they were able to catch a glimpse of each other every once in a while across the fence dividing the men's and the women's camps. But after those first weeks in Auschwitz, my great-grandmother was transferred from the camp itself to a rabbit farm on the outskirts of Auschwitz. The Nazis were growing rabbits for the fur collars for the uniforms, and my great-grandmother was transferred there as a slave laborer to work at the rabbit farm. The rabbit farm was managed by a 19-year-old Polish man who noticed pretty early on in the process that the rabbits were getting more food and better food than the Jewish inmates. And so he started to sneak food in to the Jewish slave laborers, and he was caught by the Nazis. He was beaten. But he did it again. He kept bringing food for the Jews working at the rabbit farm. And then Mason continued in telling the story to my son. He said something happened. He said, my great-grandmother cut her arm. She cut her arm on a barbed wire fence, and it was rusty, and it became infected. And it wasn't a serious infection if you had antibiotics. But if you're a Jew in that time and place, there's no way you're going to get antibiotics. And so the infection became very serious. It became life-threatening. And my great-grandmother was very, very close to death, hovering between life and death. The 19-year-old manager of the rabbit farm saw that she was dying. So what did he do? He cut his own arm on the same fence, and he put his cut on her cut, so that his cut would become infected with the same infection, which it did. And he waited. He gave it about a week, and the cut became infected, the infection became serious. He was running a fever, and he went to the Nazis. He said, I'm really sick and I need antibiotics. I'm one of your best, most productive managers. If you lose me, you're going to lose a lot of productivity on the rabbit farm. So the Nazis gave him antibiotics. He wasn't a Jew. He shared it with my great-grandmother and saved her life. So Mason said, where did I go when I left the program for that day, mysteriously? I went to visit Władek Misiuna, the 19-year-old man who saved my great-grandmother's life. He's still alive. He's still alive. He lives on the outskirts of Warsaw. I went to see him to say, thank you for my life. Thank you for my life. When I heard this story from my son, and it's a beautiful thing to hear those kinds of stories from our children, I felt something shift internally. And it was such a profound shift that I knew that this is one of those stories that can shape us. Professor Wiesel taught us that the power of a story to burst us open to empathy, to break us open to responsibility, is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. When I hear a story like that, and the next day I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person, a hungry person, if my first instinct had been to look away and to ignore them, I'm no longer going to be able to do that as easily, because the story is going to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, remember Mr. Misiuna. Remember what it's like to share the wound of another person. Remember what it's like to risk something for another person. Now, this doesn't happen all at once. It's a process over a lifetime. But if we begin to pay attention to those stories, they can really change us and work on us. And when I think as an educator, and I work with a lot of educators across the country, in the Jewish community and sometimes outside the Jewish community, I think about what kind of education are we giving our children, and what kinds of stories are we telling to our children, and what kinds of stories do we need to be telling to cultivate this kind of sensitivity. So the first principle of the mechanics of moral transformation is look for and gather stories that have moral weight. I just told you a story of moral heroism. There are also stories of moral failure that are equally powerful. They're warnings. They're warnings. They're not inspiring stories. They hurt. They hurt to hear. But they can also awaken us to what's at stake in our world and our role and our power and responsibility as citizens of the world. What it means to be a witness, and we called our project the Witness Institute based on Professor Riesel's core teaching that listening to a witness makes you a witness. Listening to a witness makes you a witness, is the idea that when you carry someone else's story, you now have a responsibility to that story. And even though if you have heard the story of, let's say, a Holocaust survivor, it doesn't mean that you know anything about what it is to be a Holocaust survivor. It's impossible to know. Still, you carry that story and you're somehow a witness to the story that you were told. To be a witness, Professor Riesel said, is the opposite of a spectator. A spectator is someone who looks at the world and sees the suffering in the world and feels untouched by it, not affected by it. A witness is someone who looks at the suffering of the world and feels implicated, and feels touched by it, feels responsible somehow to respond. And so the first job of a witness is not to look away. Very simple, not to look away. And the second question that comes up as soon as you make a decision not to look away, and this is something that our fellows deal with a lot, and it's something I think many of us deal with if we care about the world, if we're sensitive people, is how do we continuously look at the world and all of its suffering, the war in Ukraine, the situation with the Uyghurs in China, the hunger and homelessness in this country, the racial and economic injustices in this country, the rise of anti-Semitism. There's so many things that we see over and over again on a daily basis. How do we not look away from the world and yet not fall into despair? And it's important to note that this is something that Professor Wiesel struggled with in his early years teaching, because he taught, and Rabbi, I think this was right before you were there, he taught a course in 1976. You were there in 77, right? So he taught a course in 1976 that was entirely composed of Holocaust diaries, and mostly from people who did not survive, diaries that were hidden or buried during the Holocaust. Victor Stempel and others, and it was story after story of darkness. And he never did that again. He never taught a course like that again. And I once asked him why, and he said, "It's not my job to bring my students to despair." So we have to teach about the Holocaust. We have to teach about the darkness in humanity. We can't avoid that. We have to do it in a way that's motivating. We have to do it in a way that leads towards hope. And so that's what he did for the rest of his career. He taught courses on all kinds of subjects and topics. The Holocaust was an ever-present thread running through those courses and those conversations. Refusing to look away from that darkness is important. But there's also a sense of life and life-giving stories that remind us that human beings are capable of great acts of moral heroism as well, and that balance is very important. And so the second principle of the mechanics of moral transformation, and the last one I'm going to share with you tonight, the second of 7, is that hope is not a feeling. Hope is not a feeling. Hope is a choice. Hope is a moral choice. And if we choose hope, sometimes or often in spite of the evidence of history, in spite of the evidence of what we see in the world, then we are choosing to stay in the process of becoming a witness, of becoming someone who can make the world better. If we choose to give in to despair, if we throw up our hands and say, you know what, for the rest of my life, it's ice cream and binge watching my favorite shows on Netflix, and I'm not going to watch the news, and I'm not going to go outside of my house, or if I do, I'm going to keep my eyes to the ground so I don't see someone who's hungry, who might need something, then we are joining the ranks of the indifferent, and we're contributing to all the darkness and the growth of darkness in the world. So hope is a moral choice that we make over and over again. And the last thing I want to say here is that it's a very difficult choice sometimes, but it's much easier to make that choice when we're together. It's much easier to make that choice when we are in groups of people who are going through this process of committing to being witnesses, looking at the world, caring about the world, taking responsibility for the world around us, and then supporting and encouraging one another when the going gets tough, because it does. And our fellows really feel the burden of that darkness. They care so much about the world, but they have each other in those moments when things get really, really overwhelming. And I think that's an element of the recipe for moral transformation that we often ignore. We often think about moral transformation, moral leadership in general, as a solitary sport. It's not. Imagine if instead of leaders, we had pairs of leaders. Imagine if every leadership model was a chavruta, was a dyad, was a group of friends who were supporting one another, so that when one was weak, the other would be strong. When one needed encouragement, it would be there. Imagine if we all had, and I hope we do, people who really have our backs in those difficult moments so that we could choose hope over and over and over again. When Professor Wiesel said listening to a witness makes you a witness, in one moment, he said it after a student asked to see the tattoo on his arm. And this was on the last day of class in 2007 at Boston University. And Professor Wiesel took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeve and showed the number tattooed on his arm to the class, and then rolled his sleeve down and buttoned the sleeve and put his jacket on and said, "Next question." And in doing that, he deputized 65 or 70 students who were in that room to be able to stand up against Holocaust denial in particular, and other forms of evil and darkness in general. Those students, wherever they are, and I keep track of some of them, wherever they are different. They're different people because of that experience. They were transformed by that experience. They are now people who walk in the world with a sense of responsibility and a sense of power to make change in the world, and that's what we're trying to do in the Witness Institute. So thank you for listening. I want to hear your questions. And let's open this up. Alexis, who's our wonderful Witness Institute Development Director, we just met for the first time in person after a long time working together. Alexis is going to go around with a microphone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and you'll have the mic.
Is this working?
Is it working?
Hello? Help.
It's a symbolic microphone, so you feel empowered to speak, but it doesn't actually do anything.
It looks good.
Hello?
Right.
Test.
Oh.
Was that the mic, or was that just Rabbi Sorkman's strong voice?
No, it's the mic.
Hello?
Okay. Does anyone have a question? Okay.
So I'm interested in, you said that the first cohort has just finished their 15 months. And this was a group that obviously had, each of them had some connection in some way to the ideas that you were promoting. I'm wondering how the program and their 15 months together changed them and their views.
That's a wonderful question, thank you. Just to clarify, some of them didn't have a connection to the ideas or the context. Some of them had never heard of Elie Wiesel. Some of them had studied Professor Wiesel's writings. So it was a real mix in many ways. And again, conservative, progressive, from different parts of the country and beyond this country. If you asked each of them, and we asked them recently, and now we're doing a summative survey, so we'll know more, I hope, soon, but it was different for different fellows. So I'll give you some examples of things that they shared and said that we could share with others. So for some of them, like Nikki, who's the judge in Minneapolis I mentioned earlier, of all the things we did, and we did a lot of work both in studying literature and studying Jewish texts, but also in learning tools, practical tools for leadership and project design. We did a design thinking workshop, for example. We did a storytelling workshop with someone from The Moth, if you're familiar with The Moth. We brought in someone to teach about community organizing and building a movement. There were practical tools, and there was a lot of kind of contemplative study. So when we asked the group, Nikki said, of all the things we studied and encountered, it was the Hasidic tales that changed my life. Nikki's Asian American queer judge in Minneapolis, and shared with us in that moment that she told one of the Hasidic tales that we had studied to a defendant, and they wept together. the story that she told, very briefly, is a famous Hasidic tale. There was a great Hasidic master, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who founded the Lubavitch Hasidic movement, and he was imprisoned at a certain point. And when he was in prison, the warden came to him. The warden was a thoughtful reader of the Bible as a Christian, and he said, Rabbi, I have you here. You're behind bars. You can't go anywhere. I can finally ask this question I've been living with for a long time. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it says that God, after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, God shows up and says, "Where are you?" to Adam. So, Rabbi, I want to understand, why is God asking that question? Doesn't God know where Adam is? Doesn't God know everything? Why is God asking, "Where are you?" Ayeka, where are you? And the rabbi said, God knew, but Adam didn't. So the question is addressed to you, each of us. Where are you? Nikki told that story to a defendant, and it was a very profound moment for her. And I was, frankly, a little surprised that of all the things we've studied, these were the kinds of things that she got from the experience. Other fellows took more of the technical tools. I feel that now I know how to construct a story more effectively, and I can use design thinking to create a project that's much more likely to be effective. Right? So a real range of things. The one thing everyone said across the board that's very, very consistent and very strong is that before this experience, I was very lonely. I was doing things in the world that seemed very strange, unlikely juxtapositions of things. We have a fellow named Amisha who was protesting in Atlanta after the George Floyd murder and was watching as police and protesters were becoming more and more polarized from one another, and then the National Guard was sent in. So things were escalating. And she showed up to the protests with a boombox and started playing music and got the National Guard and the protesters to dance the Macarena together. Right? And this is before the fellowship. This is who she is. And I actually read about this in the news and tracked her down and invited her to the experience. So someone who's doing something so complex or with such a profound juxtaposition of protest and joy and human connection, there aren't a lot of people doing that kind of thing, and there aren't a lot of places you can go to learn how to do those kinds of unlikely juxtapositions. And so the fellows all said, I really felt lonely, and I feel much less lonely now. I feel like I have a community, which means that when I'm out there being attacked from my work, or I face a significant professional challenge, I know that there's a group of people who really support me, and that gives me the strength to overcome those challenges. That's something we heard from, a version of that from every single fellow so far.
Yeah, I'd like to, it's working, yeah. I'd like to follow up on that question. It's clear that you've had tremendous success on the individual lives of your fellows, that the teachings and the technical skills of Wazel as a teacher have an impact on them, and that is wonderful. As an institute, it seems to me that there is a second responsibility, and that is to pay it forward. How do you, if you're not choosing just teachers, as you've mentioned, who can then use those skills to teach others, how do you get this wide diversity of people to pay it forward, not on an individual basis, but on a large-scale basis, so those teachings really have a broader impact?
Thank you so much. That is really the essential theory of change of this work. Every fellow, when they apply to the Witness Fellowship, brings an idea for a project that they want to develop along the way and then bring out to their communities. And the projects evolve a lot, so whatever they thought about in the beginning is going to change over the course of the 15 months, but they're committed to, and we hold them accountable to, create a project to bring to a community of people. It could be a school, it could be a local community, it could be a layer of a local community, like activists in Atlanta. It could be the the Assyrian minority community in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. There are a lot of different expressions of what these projects can look like, but every fellow has a commitment to us and to one another and to themselves to do exactly what you're describing, because the whole point, actually the last principle of the mechanics of moral transformation is to pay it forward. Because if it stays with me, it's not even mine until I give it away. It's not real until I give it away. So in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do in this work, is pay forward these incredible gifts that I was given by Professor Wiesel. You know, he was such a generous teacher that I could never repay what he gave to me, and I know many of his students feel that way. So this is a way of paying it forward one layer, but the fellows feel the same way and they have the same kind of commitment. So the projects are the critical piece of that larger multiplier effect, that larger impact. And the projects are developed along the way, but towards the end of the fellowship, which is recent for cohort 1, that's when they really dive into very, very deep work on refining those projects. And right now, they've just finished a few months ago, the formal fellowship. So right now is when they're getting ready to launch their projects in the different communities where they live. And we're tracking the results. And it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens over 5 years, 3 years, longer perhaps, and how those projects develop and evolve. But without that critical piece, the metaphor that we use in the Witness Fellowship is, we're not quite set up this way, but imagine a circle of chairs. And imagine a circle of chairs facing inward, like, you know, in any sort of study session, you sit facing one another. And you study and you have dialogue and you encounter one another, you talk about ideas, you learn, you grow, you change, you explore. And then everyone stands up and you turn the chairs to face outward and you sit down again. It's still a circle, but it's facing out. And you do your work out in the world, and you're focusing on your work and your lane and your pathway, but you know there's a group of people behind you who have your back, who support you. You're part of a community now. You're not alone anymore. And then at regular intervals, you turn back to face inward and study and learn again. And that's really the model. So there's sort of that learning process and then application, and then bringing it back and seeing, well, what did we learn from the application? What did we learn when we created a project and brought it out to the community in Atlanta? What worked, what didn't work? How do we evolve? And how do we create an innovation? Sorry to borrow the jargon of Silicon Valley, but it's pretty accurate. How do we create an innovation ecosystem for moral transformative projects? That's really what we're trying to do with the projects themselves. Thank you.
I have a question along the same lines, but it's a prequel. How did you, in fact, get these two original groups together? You reached out. How did you advertise it so that people came and people applied? And as part of that, were you there at every session guiding and leading along the way? And do you have others with you who will do that guiding as the groups multiply?
Yeah, thank you. So your first question, we did not advertise, with the exception of one Facebook post to a specific group where we thought we might find people. That's where we found one of our fellows. But we didn't advertise. Before we launched the fellowship, Alicia and I partnered to create a kind of a test, and we gathered 20 guinea pigs who were willing to advise us and experience this in a kind of preliminary testing way. So we gathered 20 activists, scholars, and others, educators, and one museum curator, and it's a brilliant group of people to walk through the experience with us as if they were the fellows, and then reflect on what was it like, what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved, what would this look like if we were to do this with fellows in the future. And it was incredibly helpful and informative, and also gave us a real sense that there's a lot of momentum here, that the material is strong enough that we can proceed. That was really our question. We weren't sure yet. And so those people, many of them became an advisory group to the Witness Institute. We have an advisory group of scholars, academics, as well as activists and educators, and one museum curator still in the mix. And they nominated several of our fellows. And that was how we found a lot of the first cohort. And then the second cohort nominated some people for the second cohort. And the advisors nominated others for the second cohort. So it's really been word of mouth so far. And we're starting to consider how we might spread the word further. And to your second question, yes, I've been with them for every session. The sessions are monthly, and we have a bunch of other things happening in between, so it ends up being bi-monthly, really. And we're talking about the question of scale in a couple of different ways. And this really speaks to the larger impact question, which is on our minds. So number one, the projects. Number two, the cohorts themselves need to expand because we want to get more people through this kind of process. But number three, there might be ways that we can take some of this material and make it available for people who aren't signing up for a 15-month commitment. And so we're really beginning to explore that as well. And I have my eye on some people who could potentially become facilitators. We're talking about training facilitators for the future. Some of these people are fellows who I think have tremendous potential as teachers and leaders and facilitators of groups as well. And that's a question that's really a frontier question for us. We have not figured it out yet. We're just starting to explore that together. Sometimes. Mostly I'm really inspired. I mean, like many of you, I look at the world and I feel like, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get through this? How are we going to make sure that we don't fall apart? And, I think about my children and what kind of world are we leaving them? And it's a very scary time. It's just a very scary time. And I'm a person of faith and I choose hope, but sometimes you choose hope in spite of all the evidence, and sometimes you have evidence for hope. And these fellows and these experiences and conversations, the moment when two fellows on absolutely opposite sides of every single issue call each other sisters and say, I will stand up for you if you ever need me. I feel hope. There's evidence for hope, and we need evidence for hope now. So most of the time after these amazing sessions that we have and some of the public programs that we do as well, I should mention we do public programming and have recorded 6 episodes of a podcast to try to share some of this more broadly. It's not live yet. We're editing. I walk away from those experiences feeling just incredibly energized and very, very grateful that there are people willing to do this hard work in a time like the time we're living through.
Anyone? Okay.
Just curious, kind of more practical questions, like where does the funding come from for the institute? What are the eligibility criteria?
So funding has come from private individual donors and some foundations. We now have, is it 3 foundations involved? I think so. 3 or 4 and several more in process and in dialogue. It's very interesting, when you're a startup and you're in that entrepreneurial mode and you don't have a full proof of concept, but you have some initial evidence that's positive. So the people who tend to support these kinds of projects are really visionaries. I mean, they have a kind of tolerance for risk and willingness to invest in something new. And I think one criterion for that's very important is that the people leading the project need to be completely committed. They can't be dabbling. And so I'm in this for life, and we are in this for life. And so I think that's part of what translates to our supporters, but also to our fellows. And eligibility criteria, we have a very rich process of intake and processing applications. We have a committee. We have a very carefully crafted questionnaire where we ask people questions like, what's a story that you carry that has shaped you as a moral person or as a thinker about moral issues? We also ask, tell us a joke that has some moral meaning. We ask, where does your passion and the world's need come together? Where do those two things come together? Where can you imagine investing 3 to 5 years of your time if you were going to create a significant project? Right, so those are some of the things we ask them explicitly. But the criteria are, we're looking for people with passion and humility. Those things don't always go together. We want people who are really, really committed, but also willing to listen to others who are working on other issues or maybe disagree with them about important issues. We're looking for people who hold the kinds of uncommon juxtapositions or connections. Interdisciplinary approaches are really important here because one of the principles of moral transformation I did not mention is wild creativity. We're living in a time when we've created a world, we collectively and previous generations have created a world using certain tools. So if I said to you, I want you to make a Shabbat meal, and all I'm giving you is a stick of butter and a raw brisket or something. That's like not a kosher example, but like, two ingredients, right? A thing of tofu and a stick of butter, right? I want you to make a 7-course meal, right? I mean, there might actually be a cooking show on Netflix like that at this point. I don't know, but it wouldn't really be possible. And I think part of what we've done as a global society is we've used a very, very narrow toolkit, a very limited toolkit in addressing issues around hunger and homelessness and peace and war and anti-Semitism and racism. We keep throwing the same tools at those issues. And they're very cerebral, intellectual tools, and they're very kind of policy-driven. And we need to do that work on the policy side, and we need to use our brains for sure. But there are other tools in our toolkit. And some of them are in the arts, and some of them are in spiritual practice, and some of them are in indigenous wisdom traditions, and some of them are in teaching tales. So we look for fellows who are open to that kind of creativity and pushing the limits. And so we look for those juxtapositions of people who are doing, law and theology, or healing trauma and humor and improv, or indignation and protest and joy and music and dancing. Those kinds of things turn out to be one of the most important signals that we found someone who's really able to go into this work in a very, very deep way with tremendous passion and creativity. And the other thing, of course, Alicia insists on is that we have at least 2 funny people in each cohort because, well, why don't you say why, Alicia?
I mean, good luck without it.
Right. This work can become very heavy, right? So humor and lightness and improv, all those things really matter. I mean, people don't necessarily know that Professor Wiesel was hysterically funny in the classroom. I mean, he was very, very funny and loved to tell stories and jokes because he's doing something so profoundly important that if we don't counter the weight of the issues and what's at stake with lightness, if we don't attach some helium balloons to this, it's just not going to work. So we look for that too.
If you really wanted to make Professor Wiesel happy, you bring in chocolate. As I found out in 1977, and I eventually caught on. It didn't get you a better grade, right? But it made him smile. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, doing the last pieces of confirmation with 10th grade, we were all sitting in a circle right here. That row wasn't there. 20 kids, and I talked about Professor Wiesel and taught the hour-long session about Professor Wiesel. And towards the end, I quoted what Wiesel said, but I remember saying in class, where he said, Voltaire said, when all hope is lost, death is a duty. Professor Wiesel said, when all hope is lost, our obligation is to invent new hope. 3 kids are writing their Sinai statements about Professor Wiesel. So you see that what Rabbi Burger is doing and Alicia Wiesel are doing is to try to do moral transformation in amazing ways, but it's happening right here. The Witness Institute is a place where Professor Wiesel's classroom is coming to life and is literally having an impact in so many communities around the world. I think it's great. I think it is unique. If you want to support it in any way, there's these little things here. What's this called again? Alexis? I don't know what it's called. It's called a QR code. So you can click onto here and say, oh, just do it that way. I cannot tell you, and you know this, I'm a rabbi here, and the rabbi of how I am, whether it's leading Clever Torah, or teaching confirmation, or telling a story to 4-year-olds. It's all framed because of what I learned in Professor Wiesel's classroom and from him 5 years for you. So, if you, you know, and you know that, you feel it. I could not be more thrilled that Rabbi Burger and Alicia Rizzo really came here and gave us their hearts and their vision for making the world a little more holy and human. Take one of these things, but you haven't taken one already. And if you want to schmooze more, we're going to schmooze. If you're at home, too bad.
Rabbi, I have a footnote to the too bad, which is, and for everyone here and for everyone online, I saw a hand, and we don't have time to do more Q&A now, but I'll stick around, we can schmooze. But if you have a question or a question occurs to you later, I really meant what I said before. The questions are really, really precious. You might ask a question that can open something up that can help us think about this work more effectively, more deeply. If you have a question, you can email me too, and we'll continue the conversation that way. Ariel@witnessinstitute.org. Very, very simple. Ariel@witnessinstitute.org. And I will respond. It might take me a little time, but I'm committing to you to respond if you have a question or a thought. Thank you.